If you've noticed it getting hotter and hotter these days, you are not alone. Summers in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly in North America, have become entirely more abysmal with every passing year. Regardless of whether you believe in climate change, or whether you wish to chalk it up to El Nino and La Nina, or whether you think a foreign government secretly has a weather machine, the bottom line is that these hotter temperatures negatively impact our way of life. But today, I wish to talk about something very personal to me: how these hotter temperatures have led to some of the worst wildfires in recorded history, and how I got to experience several of them firsthand. In order to avoid doxing myself, I am going to obfuscate some of the geographical and time-based details, but seeing how we are currently driving around Lake Tahoe in the Sierra Nevada mountains, that should give you an idea of where these stories tend to take place. The Sierra Nevada mountain range, which surrounds Lake Tahoe, experiences, at times, some of the most hellish conditions on planet Earth. Winters can see snowfall exceeding 15 feet, while summers can see temperatures approaching triple digits on the Fahrenheit scale with almost zero humidity. I'll approach the winter stories in due time, but today the tales of wildfire take center stage. Allow us to turn the clock back by a couple of years. During one summer in particular, a wildfire broke out at a local campground and began to spread rapidly through the woods. Firefighters spent the first few days of the fire attempting to establish a perimeter, but then that perimeter was somehow broken, and the fire began burning out of control. My father and I had been boating on a nearby lake and could see the smoke building rapidly. By the time we rushed home, law enforcement was already staging an evacuation. My father, mother, and I spent the next 2 hours loading up 3 vehicles with as much stuff as we could carry, as well as the family pets. We went into our nearby town looking for a place to stay, only to discover that the hotels were either booked or were refusing evacuees. To this day, I cannot understand why evacuees were being refused, and seeing as the temporary shelters were not allowing pets, my family concluded we should travel to a city a few hours away where my grandparents happened to live. I dropped my car off with an acquaintance of mine. This person was thankfully outside of the fire zone, so that I could drive my mother in her car, and my father drove his truck, and we set off for the city in question. We arrived at 10 o'clock at night, and I was still so shaken up that I didn't sleep at all that night. What played back in my head were 2 key memories: watching literal bombers fly over my house to drop flame retardant a few miles away, and as we were leaving my town, seeing the setting sun obscured by a literal ocean of black smoke. We stayed at my grandparents' house for a total of 5 days. The worst feeling was the uncertainty of it all. A day or 2 after the evacuation order, I was listening to the radio chatter using an app on my phone, and they were talking about potentially high winds in the direction of my neighborhood. It was so bad that they were being advised to call off their air support, which would have led to a worst possible outcome. But then a miracle of sorts happened. The weather in the fire area changed drastically, and an extreme belt of precipitation accompanied a rapid drop in temperature. I mean, it got as cold as 37 degrees Fahrenheit or 3 degrees Celsius in the middle of summer. As everything became soaked, the fire suddenly began to put itself out. We had to stay where we were for another few days, but we eventually were given the green light to return home. The house smelled like smoke for about a week because one of the windows had been left open, but aside from that, there was no damage. We were lucky. Another nearby fire about a month later would put my family on the evacuation warning list, but we thankfully were able to ride that one out without having to relocate. And while those experiences were both horrifying and traumatic, nothing could have prepared me for what was going to happen in the not-so-distant future. Let's fast forward to another fire season. This one was more recent. My mother and I had been vacationing to visit my brother, who lives up in the Pacific Northwest. As we were driving home, we began to see smoke in the area near where I live. Arriving at home, I asked my father if anything had happened while my mother and I were gone. It turned out that the smoke was coming from over 100 miles away. A new fire had broken out, and it was traveling through mostly rural mountains, And while one would think, oh, most of that area has already burned in recent years, apparently there was still more than enough ground-based fuel to sustain the fire's growth. As the summer wore on, that fire began to close the 100-mile distance. Eventually, it was only 50 miles away. Then it was 30 miles away. Then it was 20 miles away. Every day and every night, the emergency alerts on my phone would blare out, signaling that nearby communities needed to evacuate. I began to wonder when my neighborhood would be added to that list. And then, to make things even worse, the fire changed direction. At the time that the fire peaked, I had traveled with my mom to visit my grandmother. My grandfather had recently passed away, so my mom and I were helping her with the process of getting her affairs in order and whatnot. Some online friends of mine were traveling to the city as they had been on vacation for a few weeks traveling this part of the country. Thankfully, they had managed to avoid all the burning areas, and I was able to meet with them and spend the night with them, as well as the following day. I decided that following day to take these friends of mine on a drive. As I was driving them around Lake Tahoe, which was thankfully not on fire yet, I began to get multiple emergency alerts on my phone. The fire near my home was now crossing major highways, entire towns were going up in flames, and the fire perimeter had now stretched across 5 counties. With the highways now blocked, I would not be able to return home. After taking my friends to the airport that evening, I returned to my grandmother's house to wait things out. I ended up spending a few days there until the roads were cleared for me and my mother to return home, only then to be placed on the evacuation warning list yet again. That fire continued to rage for another 2 or 3 months. What I remember most from that time are these things. For one, the power would fail constantly as transmission lines through the mountains were destroyed over and over and over and over. For two, there were days where the sky was pitch black, but there were also days where the sky was blood red, a color I had never seen the sky before. It literally made everything look like the surface of Mars. And of course, we can't forget all of the emergency alerts. It got so bad that my phone was going off over 10 times per day. It even woke me up from sleep numerous times, that's how bad it got. But I didn't want to silence the alerts for fear that one of them would be my home being evacuated again. So I suffered through it. And these were just the most memorable of experiences. I have lived through so many wildfires now, but you never quite get used to any of them. Seeing smoke on the horizon, seeing the flames at night, seeing the arrays of flashing red lights, hearing the helicopters and air bombers dropping flame retardant, all of these things have culminated into a literal PTSD for me. Like, I didn't realize how bad it really got until one evening I was watching YouTube videos online, and I looked up the ending to Far Cry 5. When the video showed the cutscene where the nukes go off and everything is on fire, I could feel my entire body just tense up, and I had to resist the urge to hold my breath. At the time of writing, this summer has not been very bad. I've noticed a few small fires in my town, some of which might have been arson, but I don't know for sure. But these were small. They were typically extinguished in like an hour or two. I want to say there isn't much left to burn where I live. A lot of the areas that burned in the last 5 or 6 years have all been systemically logged out. It's crazy driving some of these areas and seeing just a barren wasteland of dirt and rock devoid of trees or vegetation. And while there are patchworks that did not burn, one concern of mine is that they interweave in such a way that if they were to catch fire, they could potentially reach where I live and put me back on the evacuation list again. California in particular has gotten so bad with the wildfire thing that insurance companies are flat out refusing to write policies in the state anymore. They feel the cost of rebuild is greater than what they can sustain. If you ask me, risk management has always been a scam, but it has always been a necessary scam. We are getting to the point where the entire western US, California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and so on, is becoming inhospitable for all forms of life. Ponderosa pine trees, the most prolific species in this part of the country, do use wildfire as an evolutionary tool to germinate their seeds for planting new trees. However, when the fires burn so hot that those seeds become outright incinerated, then the forests cannot regrow. End of story. Trees and foliage are vital to the ecosystem. They provide us with oxygen, they create habitats for all kinds of wild animal, and the process of evapotranspiration raises the humidity level, which is supposed to help stabilize the ambient temperature. Regardless of your political opinions about the climate, there is no denying that seeing these forests restored, as well as properly managed, would go a long way in combating the rise in temperature, as well as helping to regulate how wildfires occur. Fire is here to stay, but we need to be better at coexisting with it so it doesn't destroy everything we know and love. I have my own personal theories about that kind of thing, but that's for a different day. This was mostly an emotive piece to really come to grips with the personal trauma of it all. I want to make it clear the things I experienced are things I would not wish on my worst enemy. I never want to go through that again, but sadly, I can't guarantee that I never will again. And I suppose that is where I will leave this. Thank you so much for watching.